All right, everybody, let's go ahead and get started, shall we? Welcome back to the Dharma Doors. I'm MC Owens, and this is the San Francisco Dharma Collective. And tonight we're going to read another sutta. We are still making our way through the middle-length discourses of the Buddha. Tonight we're going to be talking about Sutta number 80. This is going to be the final sutta in the little collection of the 10 teachings that the Buddha gave to the paribhajacas, to the wanderers. So this is going to be our 10th wanderer. And in many ways tonight, this is like the head wanderer in that way. So that'll be interesting. There'll be a lot of little connections to the sutta from last week and the week before and the week before. So a lot of little threads that we've sort of been talking about here and there. They're all going to get tied together tonight in this sutta. Um, in many ways, the teaching for tonight, we've heard this teaching before, but as usual, it's just sort of the way the Buddha puts it that makes it unique in that sense. So, and actually, we're going to have a lot of other interesting things to talk about tonight, and it has to do with who the Buddha is giving this teaching to. So, we can kind of dive right in by discussing the title, because even just the title of this one is interesting. So, thank you, Noam. Noam put the link for it's a translation. It's not the exact same translation that I'm reading from. It's pretty close, though. Just different translator, but basically the same. But the sutta tonight, the teaching tonight, is called the Vekhanasa Sutta. And if you were to read this and you were to just sort of like pick it up and read it, you would presume that Vekhanasa is the name of a person. It is sort of translated that way, it's sort of presented that way, but this is a particular type of wanderer. So, in many ways, Vekhanasa is I guess, like a title more than a name. And actually, yeah, very quickly, the Buddha is going to start referring to this person by their name, like their kind of their personal name, which is Kachana. But really quickly, let's talk about Vekhanasa, like that idea. So this is a very interesting little group of wanderers. And what it is, and I don't want to, I don't want this to turn into a whole talk about this tonight, but as you may know, there's a lot of different religious sort of traditions in India. They all get kind of lumped together under this term Hinduism. But as I often say, if you were like me and you take a college course on Hinduism, the first thing they teach you is there's no such thing as Hinduism. What there is a very diverse world of religious practices that to the untrained eye all look kind of the same. So let's just call it Hinduism. But actually, of course, if you kind of go looking around, you'll find out that there's a lot of different religions in India. And I don't mean just Islam, Buddhism, and Hinduism. I mean, even what we call Hinduism is diverse. There's one world, it's like a whole world of religion, and it's a world of religious activity in India that's all sort of directed towards or dedicated towards a god named Vishnu. So Vishnu is one of those gods. Vishnu is God for those who worship Vishnu in that way. And what I'm getting around to is that a Vekhanesa is it's a particular type of well, it's a particular type of paribhajaka. It's a particular type of wandering ascetic, but it's a particular style of practice that in the modern world has become kind of the foundation of what is known as the basically Vishnu worship, Vaishnavite, they would be called. And kind of what I want you to know is that in India today, there's a whole world of worshipers of Vishnu, but they trace their lineage back to these Vekhanasa Paribijakas. And so, what I'm kind of just trying to get around to in a roundabout way is that this sutta seems to be the oldest, earliest known record of these. Um, well, I wouldn't want to call them Vishnu worshipers because that's sort of what's going on nowadays. There's no mention of Vishnu here, but what there is a reference to is the kind of the primary teaching of the Vekhanesas. And we've already actually encountered a Vekhanesa. We've encountered a worshiper or a member of this group. And what it is that we read two different suttas, sutta number 79 and sutta number, I guess, 77. And they were both teachings to a wanderer named Udayan, the Sakuludayan. But Sakuludayan, the Buddha kept having these kind of conversations with this guy. Well, he kept referring, Udayan, he kept referring to his teacher. Well, my teacher teaches the ultimate splendor, teaches the highest splendor. Well, this guy, Kachanya, that we're going to meet, this is the teacher. This is Sakuludayan's teacher. So that's what makes this kind of significant is that the Buddha already kind of converted Udayan, and now he's going to basically convert the teacher. And the thing about it is, there is a kind of mythological, maybe real, but perhaps mythological, but there's a founder, the original teacher of this group whose name was Vekhanesa. And so what I'm getting around to, again, is that we wouldn't want to make it seem like this was the Vekhanesa and like the Buddha converted the founder of the Vaishnavite movement. No, 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 no. The Buddha, as you know, spoiler alert, the Buddha is going to convert our Kachanya, who happens to be one of these uh, particular type of wanderers. So there's a whole cultural backstory, in other words, to this particular person belonging to a whole other group. Okay, so that's the title. um, yeah, let's dive in because there's a lot of really wonderful, beautiful ideas to talk about. So let's do it. Again, this is the Vekhanasa Sutta, Sutta number 80 in the Majjhima Nikāya. And Evam, thus have I heard. On one occasion, the Blessed One was living at Savatthi in the Jeta's Grove, Anathapindika's park. Then the wanderer Vekhanesa, I would suggest then the Vekhanesan wanderer, went to the Blessed One and exchanged greetings with him. When this courteous and amiable talk was finished, he stood at one side, and in the Blessed One's presence, he uttered this exclamation: "This is the perfect splendor. This is the perfect splendor." So this is that paramo vagno, he says. So there is a very interesting footnote, and it's actually not a footnote. It's not a footnote of Bhikkhu Bodhi. It's actually a footnote of Bhikkhu Sujato, who translated the version that Noam put the link for, the online version on Sutta Central. So they have an interesting footnote to this. And what it is that there is a whole world of this, it would be called Brahmanic poetry. It's Brahmins or these kind of ritual specialists. We might refer to them as priests, but that's a little bit of a, not quite the right word in that way, but they are ritual specialists and they recite these poems. And the Vekhanesas were these poets, and there's collections of these poems that they've written or, that have been passed down to us. And in those poems, there is reference to this paramo vanyo, this highest splendor or this perfect splendor. And so there's this whole reference to achieving this blissful state. And it's associated with something in the poems, in the Brahmanic poetry, this paramovanya, this highest splendor. It's associated with a very kind of mystical substance known as soma. Soma is this ancient kind of like a kind of ambrosia, right? A kind of elixir of immortality. Some people, there's speculation that it was an actual substance, like maybe an intoxicant of some sort. There's speculation that it's an endogenous release of chemicals. There's also just a notion that soma is just a term for a blissful state. I just want to put it out there because I hadn't read this footnote last week and the week before. So I just want to put it out there that if you are familiar at all with the idea of soma in like Indian, Hindu, like religion, we're sort of talking about that tonight. Or it would seem that our wanderer is pointing to this soma, this bliss in that way. Now, this is exactly what Udayan said. This is exactly what Udayan was espousing, was this idea that, well, what my teacher teaches, who is this guy, Udayan was saying, what my teacher teaches is the highest splendor, this ultimate vanyo, this ultimate luster, right? Or like, again, it's a tricky word to translate. But then the Buddha says this. The Buddha says what he said to Udayan. But Kachchana, and again, that's the person's actual like familiar name. He says, but Kachchana, why do you say this is the perfect splendor? This is the perfect splendor. What is that perfect splendor? And then Kachana replies, oh, Master Gautama, oh, that splendor is this perfect splendor, which is unsurpassed by any other splendor, higher or more sublime. And once again, the Buddha says, okay, but Kachana, what is that splendor that is unsurpassed by any other splendor, higher or more sublime? And he repeats himself, Master Gautama, well, that splendor is the perfect splendor that is unsurpassed by any other splendor, higher or more sublime. And then, of course, if you have this version, they're going to take all of the sutra away from you. They're not going to give you the sutra. They're going to tell you to go see some other sutra. Bhikkhu Sujato's translation is the full sutta. So I do want to jump back really quickly. Now, I'm not going to read it in its entirety, but if we're going to get the if we're going to understand this sutta, we need to understand the argument or the discussion. So, Kachana is espousing this highest state of bliss or splendor, and that's the goal, that's it. And then the Buddha asks him, all right, what exactly is that? And he just keeps saying, well, it's the highest splendor. And that's when, in response to Udayan, the Buddha uses the same response here, and he says, but Kachana, you might continue this way for a long time, right? Just responding that it's the highest splendor, right? And then the Buddha uses this interesting analogy, and he uses this analogy in other suttas. And he says, well, you sound like somebody who claims to be in love with the most like beautiful girl in the world. But when asked, well, what does that girl look like? And where does she live? And what's her name? And is she tall? Is she short? The answer is, oh, I don't know. I don't know. I don't know. I don't know. And so, having been asked about this girl, it's almost like you don't even know who this girl is. And the Buddha says, you sound like that guy who claims to be espousing this highest splendor, but you don't even know what it is. And then the Buddha kind of says, so that person who's in love with a girl but doesn't even know what she looks like or where she's from, surely such a person, right? It wouldn't be sensible to talk like that, right? And the response is, yeah, that would be nonsense. And the Buddha says, but in the same way, Kachana, you say this, that splendor is the perfect splendor which is unsurpassed by any other splendor, higher or more sublime, yet you don't indicate what that splendor is. And then Kachana, apparently in the sutta, uses the same example as Udayan, where he says, oh, yeah, well, let me give you an example. And he says, it's just like a beautiful beryl gem of the purest water, eight-faceted, well cut, lying on a red brocade on a red cloth. That jewel glows, radiates, and shines of such splendor, is the self surviving unimpaired after death. So this is what that splendor is. It's this glow, it's this radiance, it's this shine that survives death in some way. And in response to that analogy of a jewel, a gem, kind of being luminous against the backdrop of a red brocade, the Buddha then gives this kind of long counter analogy. And it's almost, by the way, like it's kind of why I wanted to spend a little bit of time reminding us of this. This part here, if you were to ask me, this is to lull us into a meditative state, if you were to ask me. And what I mean is, the Buddha says, all right, Kachana, what do you think? This beautiful beryl gem of the purest water, eight-faceted, well-cut, lying on a red brocade, which glows, radiates, and shines, or a glowworm in the thick of the darkness of the night. Of these two, which gives off the splendor that is more excellent and sublime? Kachana replies, oh, the glowworm in the thick of darkness of the night, venerable sir. And what do you think, Kachana? This glowworm in the thick of darkness of the night, or an oil lamp in the thick darkness of the night, of these two, Which gives off the splendor that is more excellent and sublime? Oh, the oil lamp, sir. And what do you think, Kachana? This oil lamp in the thick darkness of the night, or a great bonfire in the thick darkness of the night? Of these two, which gives off the splendor that is more excellent and sublime? Oh, the great bonfire, venerable sir. And what do you think, Kachana? This great bonfire in the thick darkness of the night, or the morning star towards dawn in a clear, cloudless sky? Of these two, which gives off the splendor that is more excellent and sublime? Oh, the morning star towards dawn in a clear, cloudless sky, venerable sir. And what do you think, Kachana? The morning star towards dawn in a clear, cloudless sky, or the full moon at midnight in a clear, cloudless sky on the Upasatta day of the 15th. Of these two, which gives off the splendor that is more excellent and sublime? Oh, the full moon at midnight in a clear, cloudless sky on the Upasatta day of the 15th, venerable sir. And what do you think, Kachana? The full moon at midnight in the clear, cloudless sky on the Upasatta day of the 15th, or the full disk of the sun at midday in a clear, cloudless sky in autumn in the last month of the rainy season? Of these two, which gives off the splendor that is more excellent and sublime? Ah, the full disk of the sun at midday in a clear, cloudless sky in autumn in the last month of the rainy season, venerable sir. And then the Buddha says, and beyond that, Kachana, I know of very many gods whose splendor the radiance of the sun and moon doesn't even match. Yet, I don't say that there's no splendor higher or more sublime than that splendor. But you, Kachana, you say of that splendor which is lower and meaner than a glowworm's, that this is the perfect splendor, yet you don't indicate what that splendor is. So that's the recap. That's the Buddha's kind of counter argument. So it's this idea of like talking about something you've never experienced in that way, right? Versus the Buddha saying, yeah, by analogy, I know of all of these different higher splendors or higher radiances or higher glows, and I know many beyond that. And he says, I don't say this is the highest splendor, right? So he makes no claims to that in that sense. And then the Buddha is going to shift, just like he did with Udayan. The Buddha here is going to shift into a teaching. And the teaching, he says, so after the analogy of the glowworm all the way to the sun, the Buddha then says, Kachana, there are these 5 gunya, these 5 chords of kama, of sensual pleasure. What 5? Forms cognizable to the eye that are wished for, desired, agreeable, and likable, connected with sensual desire, and provocative of stimulation or attraction, raga, possibly translated as lust. That's the first chord. The second, sounds cognizable by the ear that are wished for, desirable, agreeable, and likable, connected with sensual desire, and provocative of stimulation. Odors cognizable by the nose, wished for, desirable, agreeable, and likable, connected with sensual desire, and provocative of stimulation. Flavors, cognizable by the tongue, wished for, desirable, agreeable, and likable, connected with sensual desire and provocative of stimulation. And tangibles cognizable by the body that are wished for, desired, agreeable and likable, connected with sensual desire, and provocative of stimulation. These are the five gunya, the five chords of sensual pleasure. Now, kachana, the pleasure and joy that arise dependent on these five chords of sensual pleasure, well, that's called sensual pleasure. Thus, sensual pleasure arises through sensual pleasures. But beyond sensual pleasure, there is a pleasure at the peak of the sensual, and that is declared to be the highest among them. All right, so that's our first and kind of our primary teaching of the sutta. It's about these kamagunya, they're called, the pancha kamagunya, these five cords, like ropes or bindings, these five cords of sensual pleasure or kama. So let's back up because I want to kind of like really make clear kind of what I think is going on in the sutta here. So I kind of want to break down kachana and this idea of this ultimate splendor, right? Now, if you weren't here for it, in the Udayan Sutta, it's made clear by the Buddha that the paramo vanyo, this highest splendor of this school, of these people, it's basically the same as the third jhana. This is what is said, is that basically the Buddha's like, yeah, what you're talking about is the third jhana. I teach fourth jhana, formless jhanas. I teach way beyond that, the Buddha says. But what you guys are teaching are just the third, up to the third jhana. So that gives us a clue, not a clue, that gives us a kind of a full interpretation that they are talking about reaching these meditative states. And it should, in a way, go without saying that these paribhijjakas, these wanderers, they're meditators, they're ascetics, they're practitioners, they're cultivators. Just like the Buddhists, they're doing a kind of psychophysical practice, it would seem. But these people, the Vekhanasas or Kachana and Udayan, they're doing meditation and reaching this third jhanic state, this blissful state. And they're saying, yeah, that's the highest ultimate state to reach. And then the Buddha is going to come at Kachana with this idea of the five gunya, these five chords. But again, I want to try to make just like, I want to break down what is going on with this highest splendor and then contrast it with, what the Buddha's teaching. So the way that I kind of like to think about this, I think it's helpful to to think about it this way. It has to do with a certain way of being in the world. And it's a very normal way to be in the world. I often would even refer to it as the default mode program of this situation. And what I mean is that there's a way of being in the world which is about maximizing pleasure and minimizing pain or discomfort and everything else that falls into that category. By the way, if you don't know, in the world of Buddhism, I'm basically referring to the spectrum that stretches from the ultimate state of bliss, sukha, all the way to the worst of the worst of the worst, dukkha. And so it's kind of helpful to know that that's those two words, dukkha and sukha, that those are sort of like the limits of experience. And that helps us understand the Buddhist teaching of dukkha, of suffering. If we know that it's, oh, sukha, bliss is over here, dukkha's over here. So what I'm talking about is a way of being in the world that's about maximizing sukha and minimizing dukkha. And this doesn't have to be like a spiritual pursuit. In fact, it usually isn't a spiritual pursuit. It's usually a very secular, worldly pursuit of sensual pleasure. And what I really want to kind of talk about or get to is, again, it's a mentality. It's a way of being in the world. And I was trying to think of a funny example. And the best example I could come up with was, so let's take, the Buddha's going to start talking about these five gunyas, right? Forms visible to the eyes, sounds cognizable to the ears, smells, flavors, and bodily sensations. And what I was thinking about was, you know, pleasing visual images. And what I was thinking about regarding pleasing visible images was basically the idea of like going to the movies. Don't we want to go to the movies to see fun, entertaining visual imagery coming at us? And wouldn't it be a much better movie if it had a great soundtrack? Like, meaning that the sound was a good sound. It was a fun, entertaining sound. And now what I was thinking about, I was like, oh yeah, the movies. That's an interesting example because then, you walk into the movie theater and you get that popcorn smell. Everybody loves that popcorn smell, right? So that could be an odor, right, that is pleasing to the nose, right? So now you're sitting there, ooh, I want some. I want some popcorn. I want some candy. So now I'm going to have yummy goodies to eat while I'm smelling the yummy popcorn smell, watching the cool images and listening to the fun music. If only I could have a big, comfortable chair so that my body was receiving maximum sensual pleasure physically. Maybe it had even like a little massage vibrating chair. So now I'm getting my massage in my chair while I'm eating the yummy food and smelling the yummy flavors and hearing the cool music and I'm watching the movie. All five sensual pleasures are like maximized, right? Is that what you want? Is that a good time for you? Like, is that what you're striving for in that way? To like a state in which all five sensual pleasures are at their maximum? Well, the reason why I mention it that way is because in the world of spirituality and like, religion and meditation, there can be the exact same pursuit. The pursuit of, no, I want to feel good in my body. I want to feel good in my nose. I want to feel good in my mouth. I want to feel good in my ears. I want to feel good in my eyes. And so there are these kind of very pleasant meditative states in which your body will feel good and your everything will feel good in that way. And in fact, it would seem that this group of wanderers that our Kachana belongs to, they're claiming, oh yeah, we figured out or we have the ticket to the maximization of pleasure. And we are calling it the highest splendor. We're calling it the highest because it's the ultimate state of pleasure. Now, I guess what I'm kind of, you probably see where I'm coming with this. we want to come at this, this Buddhist angle. And what I mean is of course, we want to talk about that, the idea of that fourth jhana, which is basically going beyond pleasure and pain, going beyond sukha and dukkha. So the Buddha is going to be pushing for that, for going beyond that. Whereas Kachana here, he's settling for maximized pleasure in that way. And this is what the Buddha is now going to basically start to come at Kachana with, is a counter argument to the maximization of pleasure. Right? So that's sort of I feel like that's what's going on in this sutta. And it's not exactly what we were hearing before in that way. But here, I think because the Buddha's responding with these 5 chords of sensual pleasure, that he's directly approaching this idea of the highest splendor as being the goal of practice in that way. All right. So yeah, so now let's break down, because there's really key information here. I want to break down, it's going to be, I guess, section or paragraph, section, I guess, 13, if you have this version. And it's the line where the Buddha says, now, kachana, the pleasure and joy that arise dependent on these 5 chords of sensual pleasure, those are called sensual pleasure. Thus, sensual pleasures arise through sensual pleasures. A little tautological there, but it's okay. Where the Buddha says those, but beyond sensual pleasure, there is a pleasure at the peak of the sensual. And that's declared to be the highest among them. Now, if you have this version, Bhikkhu Bodhi has an important footnote here. And I believe even Bhikkhu Sujato has an important footnote on this. And it has to do with this term, at the peak of the sensual, kamaga sukha. So even Bhikkhu Bodhi refers to this as a riddle. Like, what exactly does this mean? This idea of there is a pleasure at the peak of the sensual. This is a little bit of a riddle for a variety of reasons. So, well, actually, let's kind of keep going. So the Buddha says this thing about the 5 chords. Those are sensual pleasures, but there's a pleasure at the peak of the sensual. And that's what's declared to be the highest of pleasures. And when this was said, the wanderer Vekhanasa, or Kachana, says, "Oh, it's wonderful, Master Gotama. It's marvelous how well that has been expressed by Master Gotama. Thus, sensual pleasure arises through sensual pleasures, but beyond sensual pleasure, there is a pleasure at the peak of the sensual, and that is declared to be the highest pleasure among them." But then the Buddha says this, "Kachana, for you who are of another view, who accept another teaching, who approve another teaching, who pursue a different training, who follow a different teacher, for you, that way, it's hard to know what sensuality is, or what sensual pleasure is, or what the pleasure at the peak of the sensual is. But those bhikkhus, those practitioners who are arhats with taints destroyed, who have lived the holy life, done what had to be done, who have lain down the burden, reached the true goal, destroyed the fetters of being, and are completely liberated through final knowledge, it is they who would know what sensuality is, what sensual pleasure is, or what the pleasure at the peak of the sensual is. So that gives us the big clue of what the sensual, the pleasure at the peak of the sensual. We get a clue because the Buddha says, yeah, arhats, they know what the pleasure at the peak of the sensual is. And that is, if you're a Dharma student, if you study suttas, it's like, oh, if only the arhats know, then that means it's nirvana. And nirvana is what is understood to be the pleasure that's at the peak of the sensual. But let's back up. There's a bunch of different words, a bunch of different things are about to get thrown in here. So we want to talk about kama, and that's either K, long A, M A, or K A M M A, depending on the grammatical usage of it. But we're talking about, well, you've probably heard of the famous Kama Sutra. Not a Buddhist sutra, of course, a kind of a classic Indian literature about maximizing sensual pleasure. Mostly maximizing physical sensual pleasure in the terms of sexuality, but kama is about eyes, ears, nose, tongue, body pleasures in that way. So there's kama, and then there's the kind of the sukha that is coming from kama. So kama sukha, the pleasure born of kama. And then this idea of this pleasure at the peak of the sensual. The reason why I'm stressing the language here is because the Buddha is going to be talking about liberation. It's what the sutta is ultimately about at the end. It's why he's introduced the idea of an arhat, a liberated one. And this idea of being liberated, and it was just mentioned here, which is that an arhat, the taints are destroyed. And there's three taints. This is what is the big blockage to enlightenment. The big blockage to being liberated are these three taints. And the first of them is kama. It is the desire for sensual pleasures in that way. And the idea of those being asrava is the word for a taint. But it's helpful to kind of keep in mind that, this language of taint or defilement, purity, it's in many ways, it's not super helpful. What is helpful is to keep in mind that this is about, you could call it samsara, the cycle of birth, death, and rebirth. But if you're not into the ideas of birth, death, and rebirth, this is just about like cyclical patterns, getting trapped in cyclical patterns in our life and just keep doing the same thing over and over in that way, and then being trapped in this kind of hamster wheel. And samsara is just the big hamster wheel in that sense. So what's keeping the cyclical process going? Well, one of the three main things is desire, kama, in that way. That's what's perpetuating the wheel. This is sort of a teaching I give a lot, or it's a quick teaching. And it's that in a lot of other traditions coming out of India, the problem is your past karma, the things that you've done. And it's the idea that there's like a tsunami of past karma that is then propelling you into your next rebirth, propelling you to do whatever it is, the cyclical thing that you keep doing. So in many Indian traditions, it's this past karma that's the cause of rebirth. But in Buddhism, it's not past karma. It's present karma. And the reason why you keep getting reborn is because you love it. You love sensual pleasures. And at the moment you are separated from those sensual pleasures, The moment you have an opportunity to get back to them, you choose to go back to them. And that's what's keeping samsara going from a Buddhist point of view is your own present karmic desires. Now, there's two more taints. We'll get to those in a little bit. They're a little deeper, though. It's not just about pursuing sensual pleasures. It's actually about like pursuing existence. Meaning like another reason why you want to come back into existence is because you want to come back into existence. So this one's called bhava, being in that way. So a craving for being. And then finally, the third taint, by the way, is ignorance, avidya, that we just don't know any better in that way. And so we just kind of keep coming back to the familiar in that sense. So those are the taints, but this sutta is particularly focused on the taint of kama, of sensual pleasure in that way. Now, the one thing, well, actually, questions, comments, answers, ideas up to this point. I know there's been a lot going on. I still feel like we're getting to the point in a way, but any questions about kama, karma, anything? All right. Well, let me get to the point or what I kind of wanted to talk about tonight. I want to talk all about all this tonight, but um yeah, so let's yeah, actually, let me just I want to dive into like my little Dharma talk. It's sort of probably a little more relevant at the end of the sutta, but in the event that we don't get there, let me mention, I want to talk about these gunya, the chords. So this is what I think is really important about like a sutta like this or about Buddhism is, the Buddha uses all of these very subtle like analogies or just motifs. And so the motif tonight is about bondage and liberation, being tied up versus being free. And when we talk about liberation, I am talking about vimukti. I'm talking about like spiritual liberation in that way, for sure. So what I want to put a spotlight on in terms of like the what I think is important about this teaching, the spotlight should be on this idea of a gunya, of a bond, of a tie, of a fetter in that way. And what I mean is the Buddha uses this very particular language in that section 13 that I've come back to a few times. And he uses the language about pleasure and joy that arise dependent upon the five chords of sensual pleasure. So there's so much important information in just that one phrase. Pleasure and joy that arise dependent upon these five chords of sensual pleasure. So the first thing we want to notice is this language of pleasure and joy that are dependent upon, that arise dependent upon things. That's the first, like, or one of the first sort of little problems to notice about pleasure dependent upon things. We want to kind of notice that from a subtle Buddhist point of view, the Buddha noticed that pleasure that's dependent upon things is very precarious pleasure. And it's precarious because of that dependency. And the point is that when pleasure arises dependent upon something, that only works provided there's that thing. Whatever the pleasures arising dependent upon, So the problem is that if you don't have that thing, a pleasing visible form, or a pleasing sound, or a pleasing smell, or a pleasing flavor, or a pleasing feeling, if you don't have one of those, you can't be pleased. You don't, in a way, know how to be pleased because pleasure dependent upon things is precarious. Now, again, the Buddha hasn't quite said this yet, but that that pleasure at the peak of the sensual, well, the idea is that that's the pleasure that is not dependent upon anything. That's what nirvana is, by the way. Not being dependent at all on anything. Totally sovereign. That's what the Buddha, I understand. That's what I understand the Buddha's talking about in terms of the pleasure at the peak of the sensual. It's not a pleasure that's dependent upon anything. It's in a way transcendent of everything. And that's what makes it this sort of, well, you in the world of Buddhism, they would use the language of an indestructible or an inexhaustible pleasure. It's a pleasure that can't be it can't be gotten to the bottom of, because if my pleasure is dependent upon, I don't know, some food, the food is exhaustible. It gets used up. And then I'm out of pleasure. Whereas if I get pleasure from being independent, that goes on infinitely forever. And there's very, very like even more subtle ways to understand that. And, just to give you a little parenthetical Dharma talk here, it's not just about being dependent upon visible forms and sounds and scents and flavors. It goes further than that. And what I mean is, there could be, again, it's a kind of a default mode. There could be this idea of like me, but dependent upon the aggregation of the five skandhas, for example. So, in other words, the freedom that I'm talking about, the state of independence that I'm talking about, it goes beyond not, having addiction to things. It goes even further to even those deeper ideas that Buddhism talks about in terms of ego, the conceit of self, and all of those ideas. Even those are potential dependencies. So I'm talking about even getting rid of those dependencies so that the mind, not you, the mind is totally liberated. If mind has been put in the box of me or you, that's dependent. That's going to be dependent upon a name, on a body, on a this, on a that. So I want to kind of keep pushing us to thinking about like total independence versus a compromised, fragile state of dependence upon conditional dharmas. Because that's what the Buddha has always been talking about, is a state of dependence on the conditional or the unconditioned in that way. So the first thing is about pleasure and joy that arise dependent upon pleasure, sensual pleasures. And I was just kind of talking about the idea of dependence upon and how that's kind of precarious. The next part of this, though, is about how the Buddha keeps calling these the five chords of sensual pleasure, these panchagunya. And now it's not just that our pleasure is dependent upon, it's actually that this whether it's a visible form or a sound or a flavor, it's that we are actually trapped and bound by it. So this is where I kind of always talk about this as like two problems. One is being dependent upon something, which sucks when that thing goes away. But there's another problem, which is that I don't know how to be happy without that thing. So it's actually in charge. I lost power. I lost it and I gave it over to the food or the substance or the whatever it is. And that's what I feel like the Buddha's talking about, where the five sensual pleasures become bondage, where we become bound to them, slaves to them in that way. Now, the reason why I wanted to bring up the movie theater as a state of maximized sensual pleasure, I wanted to bring that up because I wanted to return to it. I want us to really understand, I would like us to really understand that, or I feel like Buddhism is talking about dependencies as a problem and sort of this bondage, like being trapped or enslaved in a way. And what I'm getting at is the being bound up and being dependent is the problem. The thing, the thing is just a thing. It's not good, it's not bad. My point is the movie theater and movies and sounds, they're not good or bad. They just are. But depending on how we relate to them, that's where things get tricky. And I always like to I kind of use this example a lot. I use the example of either being kind of in a situation where, like, oh, this new movie's coming out and oh, I can't wait. I'm going to be so happy when I'm watching this new movie, right? So now I have all my expectations riding on this pleasure I'm going to get from seeing this movie. And then I go see the movie, but midway through it, the power goes out. And boy, am I upset because I was having a good time and now I'm not having a good time. My pleasure was dependent upon the movie. And now that there's no movie, I don't know how to be happy. In fact, I'm mad now. So that's one way to go to the movies, which is with a lot of expectation of how much pleasure it's going to give, and then some repercussions that can come in the event that the movie stops. But there's another scenario. And that scenario is where a friend calls you up and says, hey, I heard there's this new great movie. You want to go? I'm buying. So now you've been offered a gift. And so you go to the movies with your friend and you're enjoying it. Great. I would say great. That's great. And then the power goes out. If you can turn to your friend and say, what do you want to do now? Because the movie's not happening, so let's go do something else. In other words, my pleasure wasn't dependent upon it. Sure, I was enjoying it while it was happening, but I wasn't expecting it to give me pleasure, and my pleasure wasn't dependent upon it. And when it was over, it wasn't that my pleasure's gone. So I like to use that example to point at how Buddhism, in my opinion, is not like, it's not about you not having a good time. And I always say this. I always say this. In my opinion, the Buddha thinks you're not having as good a time as you could possibly be having, actually. That's actually the problem, is you're doing all these things that are causing you suffering when really you could be having a fully liberated, blissful time. So, what's causing the problem then? It's that dependency and that bondage to it. I would say that it's not the enjoying of visible, sights. I love museums, love music, love all of these things. These are beautiful aspects of life. And again, I don't think the Buddha or Buddhism doesn't want you to experience these things. I think they don't want you to be addicted to them. I don't think they want you to be dependent upon them. And I don't think they want you to be irritable and angry when they're taken away from you. So, all right, that was sort of the Dharma talk I wanted to make sure to give, is that essential talk about pleasure and that there is a higher pleasure at the peak of the sensual. So, questions, comments, or ideas about that before we kind of finish out the rest of the sutta? Cool. All right. So, having kind of, talked about the five chords of sensual pleasure, then the Buddha says the thing where, it kind of pisses Kachana off, by the way. But the Buddha says that thing. Oh, I didn't get to that paragraph where he was angry. Sorry. But the Buddha says that thing where he says, yeah, but you have a different view. You have a different teacher. You follow a different doctrine. And so you're not going to be able to understand what sensuality is, what sensual pleasure is, or what the pleasure at the peak of the sensual is. He says, but like my followers, the bhikkhus, the arhats, who have destroyed the taints, who've led the holy life and all of that, he says, yeah, they know what sensuality actually is. They know what sensual pleasure actually is, and they know what the pleasure at the peak of the sensual is. So when that was said, the wanderer Vekhanasa was angry and displeased, and he reviled, disparaged, and censured the Buddha, the Blessed One, saying, the recluse Gotama will be worsted. You'll be disgraced. He then said to the Buddha, the Blessed One, so then there are some recluses and Brahmins here who, without knowing the past and without seeing the future, yet they claim birth is destroyed. The holy life has been lived. What had to be done has been done. There's no more coming to any state of being. But what they say turns out to be ridiculous. It turns out to be mere words, empty and hollow. And the Buddha says, uh, yeah, if any recluses and Brahmins, without knowing the past and without seeing the future, yet they claim that birth has been destroyed, the holy life has been lived, what had to be done has been done, there's no more coming to any state of being, then those people can be reasonably confuted. But rather, let the past be, Kachana, and let the future be. Let a wise person come, one who is honest and sincere, someone of rectitude, and I will instruct them. I'll teach them the Dharma in such a way that by practicing as instructed, they will soon know and see for themselves. Thus, indeed, and this is what they will know and see of themselves. Thus, indeed, there rightly comes to be liberation from the bond. That is, from the bond of ignorance. Suppose, Kachana, there were a young, tender infant lying prone, bound by stout bonds at the four limbs, with a fifth bond at the neck. And later on, as a result of their growth and the maturing of their faculties, those bonds loosened. Then they would know, I'm free, and there would be no more bondage. So too, let a wise person come, one who's honest, one sincere, one of rectitude, and I will instruct them. I'll teach them the Dharma in such a way that by practicing as instructed, they will soon know and see for themselves. Thus, indeed, there rightly comes to be liberation from the bond. That is, from the bond of ignorance. So, that bond, that last bond of ignorance, is why I mentioned the three taints, starting with kama, that kind of sensual pleasure, bhava, which isn't really spoken about here in this particular sutta, and then the third taint is this ignorance, avidya. And that is also a bond. It's a fetter that keeps you in samsara. And the Buddha is basically saying that, if somebody were to come to me, I would teach them the Dharma. And you could see other sutras to hear what the Dharma is in that regard. But he says, I would teach them the Dharma. And then they would see for themselves this liberation from the bond of ignorance. And this is a really big, important part of kind of the whole Buddhist teaching. It's the idea that none of this is on like faith or blind faith, especially kind of blind faith in the Buddha. There seem to have been, and we've read other suttas that talk about this. There seem to have been other wanderer traditions or other meditative traditions. I'm thinking in particular the way that the Nigranthas are represented. The Nigranthas were like another competing group of meditators, but it seemingly was only the leader, the Nigrantha Nataputta, that had achieved like what there was to achieve. And everybody else was just sort of like, yeah, he did it. He did it. And we follow him because he did it. And the Buddha's like, yeah, they don't follow me because I did it. They follow me because I taught them how to do it. And they did it, meaning they were liberated from the bonds of ignorance in that way. So this is kind of a big part, a big kind of aspect to Buddhism in that way, that the Buddha really, really emphasized um, seeing for yourself. And it's for kind of me, especially as a student of religion when I was younger, this is something that really attracted me to Buddhism, is that it was really like, this is only true if, in fact, there's a famous quote from the Buddha. It comes from the Parinirvana Sutra, like the Buddha's last teaching on his deathbed. And he basically, and I'm summarizing and paraphrasing, but he basically said to everybody, you shouldn't believe anything is true because you read it, because somebody told you, or even because I, the Buddha, told you. He said, you should only believe something is true if you yourself have had an experience of its truthfulness. That's the only like litmus test for truth, is if you've experienced its truthfulness. And again, that for me was something that really attracted me to the Buddhist tradition. Because I was like, oh, I approve. I approve of that approach. Like not asking me for blind adherence, but just suggesting I try in that way. So, and by the way, this teaching that I just mentioned about it's only true if you see it for yourself. This is particularly the case with the Four Noble Truths that we talked about, I think, last week a little bit. It's that idea that, the Four Noble Truths are about how, and, I think this is relevant to the sutta tonight. Those Four Noble Truths are about this kind of cause of suffering, right? And basically what the Buddha's saying is that this kind of craving and needing is suffering. And so, in other words, you're kind of doing it to yourself through the craving and the wanting in that way. And what he says is like, this is just what I teach. Think about it. See if you can notice the next time you're annoyed, pissed off, or suffering, can you trace it to something that you want that you're not getting, or something that you are getting that you don't want in that way? And so that idea of noticing, like, oh, I'm kind of causing this to myself. If you realize that, if you have an experience of that truthfulness of the Noble Truths yourself, it really opens up the pathways to the cessation of that suffering. Like if you can kind of notice, like, oh, I'm doing this. Again, now you have options. Now you have a lot of options for like diminishing or even getting rid of the suffering. But if you're confused, if you're ignorant in that sense of what's causing the suffering, and you think it's them causing the suffering to you, or you think it's that, or you think it's whatever, then you're missing what's really causing it. And that'll keep you on that hamster wheel that we were talking about earlier. So, all right. Indeed. Um, let's see. Well, I guess it wouldn't be right if I didn't finish the sutta. So the only thing left is, so after the Buddha mentions this idea of being liberated from the bond of ignorance, and he would teach anybody who came and asked him, he'd teach them the path leading to that. And then he uses this analogy of a poor little baby bound by these five bonds, right? And actually, really quickly, it was the poor little baby with the bonds, especially the one around the fifth around the neck. It's actually that's what prompted me to start talking about the Four Noble Truths. So, really quickly, allow me to digress for one moment. Regarding that teaching about the Four Noble Truths I just gave you, regarding like craving, clinging, causing suffering, for me lately, I've been having this like very clear image in my mind. And what that image is truly like a choker that is, it's connected in some kind of weird apparatus to the object of my desire. And the realization is, as I go to reach for it, I start kind of choking. And so then I back off and I'm not choking. But my life is one of like choking all the time. And my practice is trying to not choke myself to death with my own desires. So that was my little connection there with the poor baby being bound by these five bonds. But fortunately, as the child grows and their faculties mature, the bonds loosen. And then they know I am free. And by the way, that part of the baby analogy, that the you will know for yourself that the bonds are free. The Buddha will not have to tell you. I will not have to tell you. You will know. Wow, I'm not in bondage anymore to the things I used to be in bondage to. So that another emphasis on how this is you're the only test of truthfulness here. So, and when this was said, when this wonderful, beautiful sutta was said, our wanderer or our Vekhanasa wanderer said to the Blessed One, Magnificent Master Gotama, magnificent Master Gotama. Master Gotama has made the Dharma clear in many ways, as though putting upright what had been turned over, revealing what had been hidden, showing the way to one who has been lost, or like holding up a lamp in the dark for those with eyesight to see forms. I go to Master Gotama for refuge, and to the Dharma, and to the Sangha of practitioners. From today, let the Blessed One remember me as a lay follower who's gone to him for refuge for life. And that's the sutta. So the Buddha converted yet another of the Vekhanasa, or another wanderer, I should say. Yeah. Any questions, comments, or ideas? Yeah, Maria.
Since we have a little more time,
Yeah.
I when you're talking about craving, it's always about like, craving something and then our happiness being dependent on that thing being available. But yeah, this time I started thinking about sort of this idea of like too much of a good thing. And so like, maybe times when I've had too much of something that I really like and developed an aversion to it, and how that's just the other side of the same coin and still a bond, and how it's just there's this like tricky space in all practical life where we um have to practice having a healthy relationship with the things that we really like, and I guess to that end the things that we really don't like, so
Mhm.
that's my comment.
Maria, your comment, excellent comment. Even though the sutra has focused on the, let's call it the positive, like that which would be pleasurable, I think your comment about like aversion is totally equally appropriate in that way of like recognizing that, when I said the thing before, or when I interpreted the sutra by saying the bonds, it's like it's almost that you're enslaved to the thing. Well, same with aversion, where it's like, oh, I hate that guy. I hate that guy. And it's like, well, then stop talking about that guy. Get that guy out of your head. Like you're a slave to that which you are averse to as well. And it points to where that equanimity is freedom. That equanimity is liberation in that way, because you are not, you're not being pushed and pulled by the things of the world. It's another kind of image I have in my mind, like me personally in my practice. And it's when I recognize that I'm kind of like a marionette doll to sensual pleasures in the world. And it's just like, yeah, be afraid of that. And I'm like, okay, I'll be afraid of that. Want that? Yeah, I want that. And I just feel like a marionette, and I want to cut the bonds in that way. So Maria, your comment about the aversion, and I often even sometimes teach that when you really start to look at it, attraction and aversion, they're the same thing. Because it's like, when it's like, oh, I really want that. Or in other words, I'm really averse to the state of not having that. I'm really angry about not be having that. Right. So it kind of basically is the same both ways, right? Or I really want you to go away. That's the thing I want most, right? Is so, yeah. Other questions, comments, ideas? All right. Well, then on that note, because we do have just a little bit of extra time, I actually have a couple of things to mention. First thing I'll mention is about next week's Dharma Doors. So, like I said at the beginning, we finished up the section of the 10 suttas to the wanderers. And so we're moving on to the next division. And this is the division to the rajas, to the kings. And quite a contrast to go from a bunch of kind of unhoused wanderers to royalty. So I think it'll be very interesting next week and for the next series of Dharma Doors to see how the Buddha deals with royalty and like teaching the Dharma to the kings versus, again, the wanderers. So we'll probably, I think I'm going to do, yeah, Sutta 81 next time. So that'll be next week. And then, really quickly, I just want to announce that I'm going to be teaching a few courses of my own. This is through my own organization, Lotus Underground. So, starting next month in April, I'm going to be teaching two different courses. The first course is called The Eight Schools of Buddhism, and it is in kind of a survey or an overview course of basically all the different types of Buddhism in the world. And it's sort of it's an 8-week course that breaks down where each of the modern schools kind of came from, what their teachings are, what their lineages are. And then the whole course is to kind of show how they're all Buddhism, but each uniquely their own kind of style of Buddhism. So that's going to be a course on Saturday mornings, starting at the beginning of April, and that's going to be from 9 to 10:30 a.m. And then also in April on Tuesday nights from 6:30 to 8, I'm going to be teaching a course that I call the Never-Ending Dharma. And this is a kind of, it's also basically called How to Read a Sutra. And so if you've been coming to Dharma Doors and you like sutras, I teach dozens and dozens of classes on specific sutras, but I've been wanting to teach a course for a long time on just how to read all the sutras, like how to all of them, and kind of introduce you to like just sort of the world of Buddhist literature and the specific kind of like ways that these sutras are written. So if you're interested in sutras or Buddhist literature or spiritual literature, scripture, anything like that, that's going to be, again, the Never Ending Dharma, Tuesday nights, 6:30 to 8, starting at the beginning of April. That's also an 8-week course. And if you want to find out more about those, you can go to my website, lotusunderground.com, and you can register there, find out more information. Otherwise, that'll do it for tonight. And again, I'll be back here next Sunday doing that, our first of the Sutras to the Kings.